History 1. When my old man passed away, he left me not just his beloved fishing boat, but also his passion for fishing. The boat, a Rodman 1250, had a cozy cabin that made it perfect for overnight deep-sea trips. I usually took it out off the coast of Florida, sailing an hour out to sea before anchoring and spending the day fishing. One Friday, I decided to take my cousin Frank out for an overnight fishing adventure. After sailing for about an hour, I picked a spot for us to cast our lines. We had brought along a radio and plenty of beers to make the time more enjoyable. As the sun began to set, the view was breathtaking VDJ, just the vast ocean and the horizon, undisturbed. Little did we know, it would be the last pleasant moment of the night. When darkness enveloped us, we packed up our gear and headed into the cabin to play cards and munch on burgers. Mid-conversation, Frank suddenly stopped and asked me to listen. We could hear the faint sound of a boat motor in the distance. We stepped outside to take a look, but without the moon it was pitch black. We could only see about 50 feet ahead. The motor noise persisted, but the boat had no lights on. Our cabin lights were on, making us easily visible to anyone nearby. We expected the other boat to pass by and disappear into the night, but instead it circled us for a while before the motor abruptly cut off. The only sound left was the gentle splash of the waves against our boat. Frank started to get paranoid, thinking we were being followed. He wanted to use the spotlight to locate the other boat, but I thought it would be too conspicuous. To ease his mind, I decided to drive the boat away from where we last heard the engine. After a solid 5 minutes of steering in the opposite direction, I stopped the motor, and we went back inside the cabin to resume our card game. No sooner had we sat down than we heard the motor again, this time closer and softer. We rushed outside, and once again the noise stopped. I agreed with Frank that it was time to use the spotlight. The spotlight only rotated 180 degrees, so I turned the boat slightly to the right to scan the area where we last heard the motor. The beam of light stretched into the darkness, and as I slowly turned it, it landed on a boat floating not too far from us. I quickly turned off the light and told Frank to switch off the cabin lights as well. I put the boat in full throttle and sped away from the area. After about 10 minutes, we felt it was safe and decided to sleep. However, I woke up to a thumping sound coming from above the cabin. I glanced over at Frank, who was asleep on the couch, and whispered his name to wake him up. He looked at me, then up at the ceiling, clearly hearing the noise too. We cautiously opened the door to the deck and saw 2 men, VDJ1 on the bow of our boat, and the other on a boat directly beside us. Frank and I both ran outside, and the men raised their hands, claiming they meant no harm. The one on our boat said they were running low on gas and needed help. He claimed he was going to knock on our cabin door to ask for assistance. Suspicious, I flicked Frank's thigh to signal that I was ready to take action. The man stepped down from the bow to the lower deck, standing right in front of us. He was significantly taller and larger than we were. Without a word, he extended his hand, expecting a handshake. Sensing danger, I made a split-second decision. Instead of shaking his hand, I shoved him overboard with all my strength and sprinted up to start the boat, shouting at Frank to keep the other guy off our boat. We managed to lose them in the darkness and didn't stop until we reached the shore 2 hours later. We slept on the boat at the dock that night and packed up to head home the next morning. Strange things can happen out at sea in the dark, but I never expected anything like that. I still wonder what those men were planning, but I'm sure it was nothing good. History 2. A few years back, I embarked on a Norwegian cruise with some buddies. It started off as a fantastic getaway, but by the 3rd day at sea, things took a strange turn. After 2 days of devouring sushi non-stop, I began feeling dizzy and lightheaded. My friends insisted I cut out the sushi, thinking it was the cause. After a few drinks, I decided to leave my friends at one of the ship's many bars and head back to my room because I really wasn't feeling well. I took an unfamiliar route to a lower deck, trying to find my way back. Since some of the bars were on the lowest public levels of the ship, I asked one of the maids in the hallway for directions. She had a thick accent, but I understood her to say, "Keep going straight, then make a left at the sign." So I followed her directions. When I came to a sign, I turned left, but the hall I entered had a tiled floor instead of carpeting, and it felt like an employee-only section. Despite my doubts, I continued down the narrow hall, figuring I'd give it a chance before turning back. After rounding a corner, I found myself in the creepiest hallway imaginable. Half the lights were out, and one was flickering on and off. At the end of this dim corridor stood someone facing the wall. My head began to pound even more. I rubbed my eyes, hoping to clear my vision, and when I looked again, the person was now staring right at me. They stood in the dark part of the hallway, so I couldn't make out their face, but I knew they were looking at me. I quickly turned and retraced my steps. The maid was gone, but with my head still throbbing, I managed to find the lobby on that floor and easily located the elevators. I made it back to my room and collapsed into bed, convinced I had food poisoning from the sushi. My stomach hurt just as much as my head. Sometime during the night, I woke up and found myself unable to move. The only thing I could control were my eyes. I tried to look around, but without being able to move my head, it was difficult to see much. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something. When I shifted my gaze, I saw a figure standing by the wall facing away from me. I wanted to scream or run, but I was paralyzed. The figure's head slowly turned to face me, revealing nothing but darkness. The entire figure was pitch black. As it moved closer, it didn't use its limbs but seemed to float towards me. It stopped over my bed, and I could faintly see its face, VDJ. It was the same person I had seen in the hallway earlier that night. I have no idea how long that figure hovered over me, but suddenly, its mouth opened impossibly wide, and a deafening scream erupted. The scream jolted me awake from the sleep paralysis, blending with my own terrified scream. I quickly turned on the light, waking up my friend in the other bed. He asked what was wrong, and I recounted the terrifying experience. He told me again that I'd eaten too much raw fish, and it was messing with my head. I was shaking all over, my voice trembling. I eventually went back to sleep, and thankfully, I didn't have any more dreams that night. But I still wonder if that person in the hallway was real or not, because I'm almost certain that the hallucination in my paralysis was the most horrifying and realistic thing I'd ever encountered. History 3. I live on the East Coast of the United States. Recently, I moved to Florida from South Carolina. I figured it would take a couple of days to sail my boat down to our new waterfront house. I didn't have any cars with a tow hitch to carry the boat, let alone a trailer. So sailing it seemed like the best option. While my wife Jane finished moving the rest of our stuff to the new house, I kissed my family goodbye and set sail. None of them were really willing to come with me on this adventure, and I didn't blame them. Anyway, I brought enough food and gas to last the whole trip. The first day was a breeze. I got some sleep, then sailed for 10 hours the next day, taking breaks in between, of course. By nightfall, I went to bed in the cabin. Sleeping on a rocking boat isn't exactly the easiest thing to do, so I was up for hours, rolling around, trying to find a comfortable position, pressing my head into the pillow, hoping it would hide the unbearable feeling of the boat rocking over the ocean surface. Eventually, I heard sounds coming from above my head that could best be described as small thumps. It sounded like someone walking on my boat. I couldn't tell yet, but with a medium-sized fishing boat floating out in the ocean, random sounds like creaks and thumps are common. However, these thumps were coming rapidly and consistently. I started to get sick with the thought that someone out this far could be on my boat. I had to get out and look, but I wanted to be quiet. I opened the cabin door very slowly, but before I could open it all the way, I heard a big splash in the water. It sounded like someone or something jumped into the water. I was honestly scared. The thought of not being alone, even though it made no sense, was terrifying. I didn't want to go outside, but I felt I should move the boat away from whoever or whatever was out there in the water. I ran to the cockpit and started the engine. I gave the boat some gas and got away from there immediately. I heard my boat bump into something in the water, not something heavy enough to cause an impact, but heavy enough to hear and slightly feel. I didn't see what it was because, to be honest, I wasn't paying attention to whatever was out in the water. Plus, the lights weren't on anyway. I sailed for a few hours in the deep night because I was wide awake. When I started to get tired, I killed the motor and went back to bed. Emphasis on the word bed, not sleep, because even though I felt tired, I was still having trouble falling asleep. I figured half an hour had passed, and I started hearing more thumps. This time the thumps seemed louder and more clear. In a split second, my heart started racing again. The thumps were consistent and deliberate sounding. Again, no way it was just boat noises. I felt like I was being followed by someone. I couldn't just sit there and hide in the cabin all night. I had to sum up the courage to go outside again. When I checked, there was no one on the entire boat. Was it my imagination? Were these sounds really just coming from the boat? I decided that must have been the case and went back inside the cabin to bed. I lay there extremely silent, trying to listen for any little noise. When I did this, I heard something I knew I did. It wasn't the sound of thumping or anything like that. I had to perk up my ears to really pay attention, and I figured out what I was hearing. It wasn't the sound of the wind outside or the water hitting the boat. It was the sound of someone breathing. It was not my breathing, but someone else's. It was coming from inside the cabin. Of course, I panicked, but I tried to maintain composure so it wouldn't be obvious. I got out of bed, walked outside the cabin, and locked myself in the cockpit. I intended on sailing until I could find a dock by the shore. There is a small window that looks into the cockpit from the cabin. It has a curtain. I turned to it every minute or so, at least once, to look back, expecting to see someone watching me. One of the times I looked back, I did see someone. The curtain was curved up a little bit in the corner, and I saw someone's eye and maybe a quarter of their face peeking into the cockpit. I turned away right away, acting like I didn't see them. I had the thought, what if it was my young son trying to scare me? But it wouldn't make sense. I saw him waving goodbye when I set sail from the house. It was 3 or 4 tense hours of hell, thinking at any moment someone could break into the cockpit and stab me. But I made it to shore and sailed through the narrow canal. I had already called the cops 15 minutes earlier, requesting they have a few officers waiting at the dock I was headed to. It was still dark out, but I saw people standing on the dock, and I couldn't have been more excited to get there. When I stopped the boat next to the dock, I came out from the cockpit screaming at the officers to help, pointing at the cabin door. 2 officers went into the cabin with their hands on their pistols. 10 seconds later, I heard them yelling at someone. They pulled out some guy with really long gray wet hair and a similar beard, wearing wet, skinny ripped jeans and a gray t-shirt. They had him in cuffs. As they walked him past me, he looked at me and just laughed this insanely off-putting laugh. The guy looked and sounded like a meth head, the best way I could describe him. The police questioned him, but he never answered anything as to how or when he got on my boat or what he was trying to do. Thinking back, when I heard breathing in my cabin, it's likely he was hiding under my bed, and that's the most horrifying thought imaginable. By then I was exhausted and went back to my cabin and fell asleep right away. By late morning, I made it to the new house and my nightmarish adventure was over.